Indignation, the sense of moral insecurity engendered by such a treacherous proceeding, joined to the immediate apprehension of a broken neck, would, in the colloquial phrase, put him in a state. And there would be also some scandalized concern for his art, too, since a man must identify himself with something more tangible than his own personality, and establish his pride somewhere, either in his social position or in the quality of the work he is obliged to do, or simply in the superiority of the idleness he may be fortunate enough to enjoy. "Yes," said the assistant commissioner, "I have. I do not mean to say that you have not thought of Michaelis at all, but you are giving the fact you've mentioned a prominence which strikes me as not quite candid, Inspector Heat. If that is really the track of discovery, why haven't you followed it up at once, either personally or by sending one of your men to that village?" "Do you think, sir, I have failed in my duty there?" the chief inspector asked, in a tone which he sought to make simply reflective. Forced unexpectedly to concentrate his faculties upon the task of preserving his balance, he had seized upon that point and exposed himself to a rebuke. For the assistant commissioner, frowning slightly, observed that this was a very improper remark to make. "But since you've made it," he continued coldly, "I'll tell you that this is not my meaning." He paused with a straight glance of his sunken eyes, which was a full equivalent of the unspoken termination, "and you know it." The head of the so-called Special Crimes Department, debarred by his position from going out of doors personally in quest of secrets locked up in guilty breasts, had a propensity to exercise his considerable gifts for the detection of incriminating truth upon his own subordinates. That peculiar instinct could hardly be called a weakness. It was natural. He was a born detective. It had unconsciously governed his choice of a career, and if it ever failed him in life, it was perhaps in the one exceptional circumstance of his marriage, which was also natural. It fed, since it could not roam abroad, upon the human material which was brought to it in its official seclusion. We can never cease to be ourselves. His elbow on the desk, his thin legs crossed and nursing his cheek in the palm of his meager hand, the assistant commissioner in charge of the Special Crimes Branch was getting hold of the case with growing interest. His chief inspector, if not an absolutely worthy foeman of his penetration, was at any rate the most worthy of all within his reach. A mistrust of established reputations was strictly in character with the assistant commissioner's ability as detector. His memory evoked a certain old, fat, and wealthy native chief in the distant colony, whom it was a tradition for the successive colonial governors to trust and make much of, as a firm friend and supporter of the order and legality established by white men, whereas when examined skeptically, he was found out to be principally his own good friend and nobody else's. Not precisely a traitor, but still a man of many dangerous reservations in his fidelity, caused by a due regard for his own advantage, comfort, and safety. A fellow of some innocence in his naive duplicity, but none the less dangerous. He took some finding out. He was physically a big man, too, and allowing for the difference of color, of course. Chief Inspector Heat's appearance recalled him to the memory of his superior. It was not the eyes, nor yet the lips exactly. It was bizarre. But does not Alfred Wallace relate in his famous book on the Malay archipelago how, amongst the Aru Islanders, he discovered in an old and naked savage with a sooty skin a peculiar resemblance to a dear friend at home? For the first time since he took up his appointment, the assistant commissioner felt as if he were going to do some real work for his salary, and that was a pleasurable sensation. I'll turn him inside out like an old glove, thought the assistant commissioner, with his eyes resting pensively upon Chief Inspector Heat. No, that was not my thought, he began again. There is no doubt about you knowing your business, no doubt at all. And that's precisely why He stopped short and, changing his tone, "What could you bring up against Michaelis of a definite nature? I mean, apart from the fact that the two men under suspicion, you're certain there were two of them, came last from a railway station within 3 miles of the village where Michaelis is living now." "This by itself is enough for us to go upon, sir, with that sort of man," said the chief inspector with returning composure. The slight approving movement of the assistant commissioner's head went far to pacify the resentful astonishment of the renowned officer, for Chief Inspector Heat was a kind man, an excellent husband, a devoted father, and the public and departmental confidence he enjoyed, acting favorably upon an amiable nature, disposed him to feel friendly towards the successive assistant commissioners he had seen pass through that very room. There had been 3 in his time. The first one, a soldierly, abrupt, red-faced person with white eyebrows and an explosive temper, could be managed with a silken thread. He left on reaching the age limit. The second, a perfect gentleman, knowing his own and everybody else's place to a nicety, on resigning to take up a higher appointment out of England, got decorated for, really, Inspector Heat's services. To work with him had been a pride and a pleasure. The third, a bit of a dark horse from the first, was at the end of 18 months something of a dark horse still to the department. Upon the whole, Chief Inspector Heat believed him to be in the main harmless, odd-looking but harmless. He was speaking now, and the Chief Inspector listened with outward deference, which means nothing, being a matter of duty, and inwardly with benevolent toleration. "Michaelis reported himself before leaving London for the country?" "Yes, sir, he did." "And what may he be doing there?" continued the assistant commissioner, who was perfectly informed on that point. Fitted with painful tightness into an old wooden armchair before a worm-eaten oak table in an upstairs room of a 4-roomed cottage with a roof of moss-grown tiles, Michaelis was writing night and day in a shaky, slanting hand that autobiography of a prisoner which was to be like a book of Revelation in the history of mankind. The conditions of confined space, seclusion, and solitude in a small 4-roomed cottage were favorable to his inspiration. It was like being in prison, except that one was never disturbed for the odious purpose of taking exercise according to the tyrannical regulations of his old home in the penitentiary. He could not tell whether the sun still shone on the earth or not. The perspiration of the literary labor dropped from his brow. A delightful enthusiasm urged him on. It was the liberation of his inner life, the letting out of his soul into the wide world. And the zeal of his guileless vanity, first awakened by the offer of £500 from a publisher, seemed something predestined and holy. "It would be, of course, most desirable to be informed exactly," insisted the assistant commissioner uncandidly. Chief Inspector Heat, conscious of renewed irritation at this display of scrupulousness, said that the county police had been notified from the first of Michaelis's arrival, and that a full report could be obtained in a few hours, a wire to the superintendent. Thus he spoke rather slowly, while his mind seemed already to be weighing the consequences. A slight knitting of the brow was the outward sign of this, but he was interrupted by a question. "You've sent that wire already?" "No, sir," he answered, as if surprised. The assistant commissioner uncrossed his legs suddenly. The briskness of that movement contrasted with the casual way in which he threw out a suggestion. "Would you think that Michaelis had anything to do with the preparation of that bomb, for instance?" The chief inspector assumed a reflective manner. "I wouldn't say so. There's no necessity to say anything at present. He associates with men who are classed as dangerous. He was made a delegate of the Red Committee less than a year after his release on license. A sort of compliment, I suppose." And the chief inspector laughed a little angrily, a little scornfully. With a man of that sort, scrupulousness was a misplaced and even an illegal sentiment. The celebrity bestowed upon Michaelis on his release 2 years ago by some emotional journalists in want of special copy had rankled ever since in his breast. It was perfectly legal to arrest that man on the barest suspicion. It was legal and expedient on the face of it. His 2 former chiefs would have seen the point at once, whereas this one, without saying either yes or no, sat there as if lost in a dream. Moreover, besides being legal and expedient, the arrest of Michaelis solved a little personal difficulty which worried Chief Inspector Heat somewhat. This difficulty had its bearing upon his reputation, upon his comfort, and even upon the efficient performance of his duties. For if Michaelis no doubt knew something about this outrage, the chief inspector was fairly certain that he did not know too much. This was just as well. He knew much less, the chief inspector was positive, than certain other individuals he had in his mind, but whose arrest seemed to him inexpedient, besides being a more complicated matter on account of the rules of the game. The rules of the game did not protect so much Michaelis, who was an ex-convict. It would be stupid not to take advantage of legal facilities, and the journalists who had written him up with emotional gush would be ready to write him down with emotional indignation. This prospect, viewed with confidence, had the attraction of a personal triumph for Chief Inspector Heat, and deep down in his blameless bosom of an average married citizen, almost unconscious but potent nevertheless, the dislike of being compelled by events to meddle with the desperate ferocity of the professor had its say. This dislike had been strengthened by the chance meeting in the lane. The encounter did not leave behind with Chief Inspector Heat that satisfactory sense of superiority the members of the police force get from the unofficial but intimate side of their intercourse with the criminal classes, by which the vanity of power is soothed, and the vulgar love of domination over our fellow creatures is flattered as worthily as it deserves. The perfect anarchist was not recognized as a fellow creature by Chief Inspector Heat. He was impossible, a mad dog to be left alone. Not that the Chief Inspector was afraid of him. On the contrary, he meant to have him some day. But not yet. He meant to get hold of him in his own time, properly and effectively, according to the rules of the game. The present was not the right time for attempting that feat, not the right time for many reasons, personal and of public service. This being the strong feeling of Inspector Heat, it appeared to him just and proper that this affair should be shunted off its obscure and inconvenient track, leading goodness knows where, into a quiet and lawful siding called Michaelis. And he repeated, as if reconsidering the suggestion conscientiously, "The bomb. No, I would not say that exactly. We may never find that out. But it's clear that he is connected with this in some way, which we can find out without much trouble." His countenance had that look of grave, overbearing indifference once well known and much dreaded by the better sort of thieves. Chief Inspector Heat, though what is called a man, was not a smiling animal, but his inward state was that of satisfaction at the passively receptive attitude of the assistant commissioner, who murmured gently, "And you really think that the investigation should be made in that direction?" "I do, sir." "Quite convinced?" "I am, sir. That's the true line for us to take." The assistant commissioner withdrew the support of his hand from his reclining head with a suddenness that, considering his languid attitude, seemed to menace his whole person with collapse. But, on the contrary, he sat up, extremely alert, behind the great writing table on which his hand had fallen with the sound of a sharp blow. "What I want to know is what put it out of your head till now." "Put it out of my head?" repeated the chief inspector very slowly. Yes, till you were called into this room, you know. The chief inspector felt as if the air between his clothing and his skin had become unpleasantly hot. It was the sensation of an unprecedented and incredible experience. Of course, he said, exaggerating the deliberation of his utterance to the utmost limits of possibility, if there is a reason, of which I know nothing, for not interfering with the convict Michaelis, perhaps it's just as well I didn't start the county police after him. This took such a long time to say that the unflagging attention of the assistant commissioner seemed a wonderful feat of endurance. His retort came without delay. No reason whatever that I know of. Come, Chief Inspector, this finessing with me is highly improper on your part, highly improper, and it's also unfair, you know. You shouldn't leave me to puzzle things out for myself like this, really. I am surprised. He paused, then added smoothly, I need scarcely tell you that this conversation is altogether unofficial. These words were far from pacifying the chief inspector. The indignation of a betrayed tightrope performer was strong within him. In his pride of a trusted servant, he was affected by the assurance that the rope was not shaken for the purpose of breaking his neck, as by an exhibition of impudence, as if anybody were afraid. Assistant commissioners come and go, but a valuable chief inspector is not an ephemeral office phenomenon. He was not afraid of getting a broken neck. To have his performance spoiled was more than enough to account for the glow of honest indignation. And as thought is no respecter of persons, the thought of Chief Inspector Heat took a threatening and prophetic shape. You, my boy, he said to himself, keeping his round and habitually roving eye fastened upon the assistant commissioner's face. You, my boy, don't know your place, and your place won't know you very long either, I bet. As if in provoking answer to that thought, something like the ghost of an amiable smile passed on the lips of the assistant commissioner. His manner was easy and businesslike while he persisted in administering another shake to the tightrope. Let us come now to what you have discovered on the spot, Chief Inspector, he said. A fool and his job are soon parted, went on the train of prophetic thought in Chief Inspector Heat's head, but it was immediately followed by the reflection that a higher official, even when fired out, this was the precise image, has still the time as he flies through the door to launch a nasty kick at the shin bones of a subordinate. Without softening very much the basilisk nature of his stare, he said impassively, We are coming to that part of my investigation, sir. That's right. Well, what have you brought away from it? The chief inspector, who had made up his mind to jump off the rope, came to the ground with gloomy frankness. I've brought away an address, he said, pulling out of his pocket without haste a singed rag of dark blue cloth. This belongs to the overcoat the fellow who got himself blown to pieces was wearing. Of course, the overcoat may not have been his and may even have been stolen, but that's not at all probable if you look at this. The chief inspector, stepping up to the table, smoothed out carefully the rag of blue cloth. He had picked it up from the repulsive heap in the mortuary, because a tailor's name is found sometimes under the collar. It is not often of much use, but still. He only half expected to find anything useful, but certainly he did not expect to find, not under the collar at all, but stitched carefully on the underside of the lapel, a square piece of calico with an address written on it in marking ink. The chief inspector removed his smoothing hand. I carried it off with me without anybody taking notice, he said. I thought it best. It can always be produced if required. The assistant commissioner, rising a little in his chair, pulled the cloth over to his side of the table. He sat looking at it in silence. Only the number 32 and the name of Brett Street were written in marking ink on a piece of calico, slightly larger than an ordinary cigarette paper. He was genuinely surprised. "Can't understand why he should have gone about labeled like this," he said, looking up at Chief Inspector Heat. "It's a most extraordinary thing. I met once in the smoking room of a hotel an old gentleman who went about with his name and address sewn on in all his coats, in case of an accident or sudden illness," said the Chief Inspector. "He professed to be 84 years old, but he didn't look his age. He told me he was also afraid of losing his memory suddenly, like those people he had been reading of in the papers." A question from the assistant commissioner, who wanted to know what was number 32 Brett Street, interrupted that reminiscence abruptly. The chief inspector, driven down to the ground by unfair artifices, had elected to walk the path of unreserved openness. If he believed firmly that to know too much was not good for the department, the judicious holding back of knowledge was as far as his loyalty dared to go for the good of the service. If the assistant commissioner wanted to mismanage this affair, nothing, of course, could prevent him. But on his own part, he now saw no reason for a display of alacrity, so he answered concisely, "It's a shop, sir." The assistant commissioner, with his eyes lowered on the rag of blue cloth, waited for more information. As that did not come, he proceeded to obtain it by a series of questions propounded with gentle patience. Thus he acquired an idea of the nature of Mr. Verloc's commerce, of his personal appearance, and heard at last his name. In a pause, the assistant commissioner raised his eyes and discovered some animation on the chief inspector's face. They looked at each other in silence. "Of course," said the latter, "the department has no record of that man." "Did any of my predecessors have any knowledge of what you have told me now?" asked the assistant commissioner, putting his elbows on the table and raising his joined hands before his face as if about to offer prayer, only that his eyes had not a pious expression. "No, sir, certainly not. What would have been the object? That sort of man could never be produced publicly to any good purpose. It was sufficient for me to know who he was and to make use of him in a way that could be used publicly." "And do you think that sort of private knowledge consistent with the official position you occupy?" "Perfectly, sir. I think it quite proper. I will take the liberty to tell you, sir, that it makes me what I am. And I am looked upon as a man who knows his work. It's a private affair of my own. A personal friend of mine in the French police gave me the hint that that fellow was an embassy spy. Private friendship, private information, private use of it, that's how I look upon it." The assistant commissioner, after remarking to himself that the mental state of the renowned chief inspector seemed to affect the outline of his lower jaw, as if the lively sense of his high professional distinction had been located in that part of his anatomy, dismissed the point for the moment with a calm, "I see." Then, leaning his cheek on his joined hands, "Well then, speaking privately, if you like, how long have you been in private touch with this embassy spy?" To this inquiry, the private answer of the chief inspector, so private that it was never shaped into audible words, was, "Long before you were even thought of for your place here." The, so to speak, public utterance was much more precise. "I saw him for the first time in my life a little more than 7 years ago, when 2 Imperial Highnesses and the Imperial Chancellor were on a visit here. I was put in charge of all the arrangements for looking after them. Baron Stott-Wartenheim was ambassador then. He was a very nervous old gentleman. One evening, 3 days before the Guildhall banquet, he sent word that he wanted to see me for a moment. I was downstairs, and the carriages were at the door to take the Imperial Highnesses and the Chancellor to the opera. I went up at once. I found the Baron walking up and down his bedroom in a pitiable state of distress, squeezing his hands together. He assured me he had the fullest confidence in our police and in my abilities, but he had there a man just come over from Paris whose information could be trusted implicitly. He wanted me to hear what that man had to say. He took me at once into a dressing room next door, where I saw a big fellow in a heavy overcoat sitting all alone on a chair and holding his hat and stick in one hand. The Baron said to him in French, "Speak, my friend." The light in that room was not very good. I talked with him for some 5 minutes, perhaps. He certainly gave me a piece of very startling news. Then the Baron took me aside nervously to praise him up to me, and when I turned round again, I discovered that the fellow had vanished like a ghost. Got up and sneaked out down some back stairs, I suppose. There was no time to run after him, as I had to hurry off after the ambassador down the great staircase and see the party started safe for the opera. However, I acted upon the information that very night. Whether it was perfectly correct or not, it did look serious enough. Very likely it saved us from an ugly trouble on the day of the imperial visit to the city. Some time later, a month or so after my promotion to chief inspector, my attention was attracted to a big burly man I thought I had seen somewhere before, coming out in a hurry from a jeweller's shop in the Strand. I went after him, as it was on my way towards Charing Cross, and there, seeing one of our detectives across the road, I beckoned him over and pointed out the fellow to him with instructions to watch his movements for a couple of days and then report to me. No later than next afternoon, my man turned up to tell me that the fellow had married his landlady's daughter at a registrar's office that very day at 11:30 a.m., and had gone off with her to Margate for a week. Our man had seen the luggage being put on the cab. There were some old Paris labels on one of the bags. Somehow I couldn't get the fellow out of my head, and the very next time I had to go to Paris on service, I spoke about him to that friend of mine in the Paris police. My friend said, "From what you tell me, I think you must mean a rather well-known hanger-on, an emissary of the Revolutionary Red Committee. He says he is an Englishman by birth. We have an idea that he has been for a good few years now a secret agent of one of the foreign embassies in London." This woke up my memory completely. He was the vanishing fellow I saw sitting on a chair in Baron Stott-Wartenheim's bathroom. I told my friend that he was quite right. The fellow was a secret agent, to my certain knowledge. Afterwards, my friend took the trouble to ferret out the complete record of that man for me. I thought I had better know all there was to know, but I don't suppose you want to hear his history now, sir? The assistant commissioner shook his supported head. "The history of your relations with that useful personage is the only thing that matters just now," he said, closing slowly his weary, deep-set eyes, and then opening them swiftly with a greatly refreshed glance. "There's nothing official about them," said the chief inspector bitterly. "I went into his shop one evening, told him who I was, and reminded him of our first meeting. He didn't as much as twitch an eyebrow. He said that he was married and settled now, and that all he wanted was not to be interfered in his little business. I took it upon myself to promise him that, as long as he didn't go in for anything obviously outrageous, he would be left alone by the police. That was worth something to him, because a word from us to the custom house people would have been enough to get some of these packages he gets from Paris and Brussels opened in Dover, with confiscation to follow for certain, and perhaps a prosecution as well at the end of it." "That's a very precarious trade," murmured the assistant commissioner. "Why did he go in for that?" The chief inspector raised scornful eyebrows dispassionately. "Most likely got a connection, friends on the continent, amongst people who deal in such wares. They would be just the sort he would consort with. He's a lazy dog, too, like the rest of them. What do you get from him in exchange for your protection?" The chief inspector was not inclined to enlarge on the value of Mr. Verloc's services. "He would not be much good to anybody but myself. One has got to know a good deal beforehand to make use of a man like that. I can understand the sort of hint he can give, and when I want a hint, he can generally furnish it to me." The chief inspector lost himself suddenly in a discreet, reflective mood, and the assistant commissioner repressed a smile at the fleeting thought that the reputation of Chief Inspector Heat might possibly have been made in a great part by the secret agent Verloc. In a more general way of being of use, all our men of the Special Crimes Section on duty at Charing Cross and Victoria have orders to take careful notice of anybody they may see with him. He meets the new arrivals frequently, and afterwards keeps track of them. He seems to have been told off for that sort of duty. When I want an address in a hurry, I can always get it from him. Of course, I know how to manage our relations. I haven't seen him to speak to 3 times in the last 2 years. I drop him a line unsigned, and he answers me in the same way at my private address. From time to time, the assistant commissioner gave an almost imperceptible nod. The chief inspector added that he did not suppose Mr. Verloc to be deep in the confidence of the prominent members of the Revolutionary International Council, but that he was generally trusted. Of that there could be no doubt. "Whenever I've had reason to think there was something in the wind," he concluded, "I've always found he could tell me something worth knowing." The assistant commissioner made a significant remark. "He failed you this time." "Neither had I wind of anything in any other way," retorted Chief Inspector Heat. "I asked him nothing, so he could tell me nothing. He isn't one of our men. It isn't as if he were in our pay." "No," muttered the assistant commissioner. "He's a spy in the pay of a foreign government. We could never confess to him." "I must do my work in my own way," declared the chief inspector. "When it comes to that, I would deal with the devil himself and take the consequences. There are things not fit for everybody to know." "Your idea of secrecy seems to consist in keeping the chief of your department in the dark. That's stretching it perhaps a little too far, isn't it? He lives over his shop?" "Who, Verloc? Oh, yes. He lives over his shop. The wife's mother, I fancy, lives with them." "Is the house watched?" "Oh, dear, no, it wouldn't do. Certain people who come there are watched. My opinion is he knows nothing of this affair." "How do you account for this?" The assistant commissioner nodded at the cloth rag lying before him on the table. "I don't account for it at all, sir. It's simply unaccountable. It can't be explained by what I know." The chief inspector made those admissions with the frankness of a man whose reputation is established as if on a rock. "At any rate, not at this present moment. I think that the man who had most to do with it will turn out to be Michaelis." "You do?" "Yes, sir, because I can answer for all the others." "What about that other man supposed to have escaped from the park?" "I should think he's far away by this time," opined the chief inspector. The assistant commissioner looked hard at him and rose suddenly as though having made up his mind to some course of action. As a matter of fact, he had that very moment succumbed to a fascinating temptation. The chief inspector heard himself dismissed, with instructions to meet his superior early next morning for further consultation upon the case. He listened with an impenetrable face and walked out of the room with measured steps. Whatever might have been the plans of the assistant commissioner, they had nothing to do with that desk work, which was the bane of his existence because of its confined nature and apparent lack of reality. It could not have had, or else the general air of alacrity that came upon the assistant commissioner would have been inexplicable. As soon as he was left alone, he looked for his hat impulsively and put it on his head. Having done that, he sat down again to reconsider the whole matter. But as his mind was already made up, that did not take long, and before Chief Inspector Heat had gone very far on the way home, he also left the building. Chapter 7. The assistant commissioner walked along a short and narrow street like a wet, muddy ditch, then crossing a very broad thoroughfare, entered a public edifice and sought speech with a young private secretary, unpaid, of a great personage. This fair, smooth-faced young man, whose symmetrically arranged hair gave him the air of a large and neat schoolboy, met the assistant commissioner's request with a doubtful look and spoke with bated breath.
"Would he see you?" "I don't know about that. He has walked over from the house an hour ago to talk with the permanent undersecretary, and now he's ready to walk back again. He might have sent for him, but he does it for the sake of a little exercise, I suppose. It's all the exercise he can find time for while this session lasts. I don't complain. I rather enjoy these little strolls. He leans on my arm and doesn't open his lips. But I say he's very tired and, well, not in the sweetest of tempers just now."
"It's in connection with that Greenwich affair."
"Oh, I say. He's very bitter against you people, but I will go and see if you insist."
"Do. That's a good fellow," said the assistant commissioner. The unpaid secretary admired this pluck. Composing himself for an innocent face, he opened a door and went in with the assurance of a nice and privileged child. And presently he reappeared with a nod to the assistant commissioner, who, passing through the same door left open for him, found himself with the great personage in a large room. Vast in bulk and stature, with a long white face which, broadened at the base by a big double chin, appeared egg-shaped in the fringe of thin grayish whisker, the great personage seemed an expanding man. Unfortunate from a tailoring point of view, the crossfolds in the middle of a buttoned black coat added to the impression, as if the fastenings of the garment were tried to the utmost. From the head, set upward on a thick neck, the eyes, with puffy lower lids, stared with a haughty droop on each side of a hooked, aggressive nose, nobly salient in the vast, pale circumference of the face. A shiny silk hat and a pair of worn gloves lying ready on the end of a long table looked expanded too, enormous. He stood on the hearth-rug in big, roomy boots and uttered no word of greeting. "I would like to know if this is the beginning of another dynamite campaign," he asked at once in a deep, very smooth voice. "Don't go into details. I have no time for that." The assistant commissioner's figure before this big and rustic presence had the frail slenderness of a reed addressing an oak. And indeed the unbroken record of that man's descent surpassed in the numbers of centuries the age of the oldest oak in the country. "No, as far as one can be positive about anything, I can assure you that it is not." "Yes, but your idea of assurances over there," said the great man with a contemptuous wave of his hand towards a window giving on the broad thoroughfare, "seems to consist mainly in making the Secretary of State look a fool. I have been told positively in this very room less than a month ago that nothing of the sort was even possible." The assistant commissioner glanced in the direction of the window calmly. "You will allow me to remark, Sir Ethelred, that so far I have had no opportunity to give you assurances of any kind." The haughty droop of the eyes was focused now upon the assistant commissioner. "True," confessed the deep, smooth voice. "I sent for heat. You are still rather a novice in your new berth. And how are you getting on over there?" "I believe I am learning something every day." Of course. I hope you will get on." "Thank you," said Ethelred. "I've learned something today, and even within the last hour or so. There is much in this affair of a kind that does not meet the eye in a usual anarchist outrage, even if one looked into it as deep as can be. That's why I am here." The great man put his arms akimbo, the backs of his big hands resting on his hips. "Very well, go on. Only no details, pray. Spare me the details." "You shall not be troubled with them, Sir Ethelred," the Assistant Commissioner began with a calm and untroubled assurance. While he was speaking, the hands on the face of the clock behind the great man's back, a heavy, glistening affair of massive scrolls in the same dark marble as the mantelpiece, and with a ghostly, evanescent tick, had moved through the space of 7 minutes. He spoke with a studious fidelity to a parenthetical manner, into which every little fact, that is, every detail, fitted with delightful ease. Not a murmur, nor even a movement, hinted at interruption. The great personage might have been the statue of one of his own princely ancestors, stripped of a crusader's war harness and put into an ill-fitting frock-coat. The Assistant Commissioner felt as though he were at liberty to talk for an hour, but he kept his head, and at the end of the time mentioned above, he broke off with a sudden conclusion, which, reproducing the opening statement, pleasantly surprised Sir Ethelred by its apparent swiftness and force. "The kind of thing which meets us under the surface of this affair, otherwise without gravity, is unusual, in this precise form at least, and requires special treatment." The tone of Sir Ethelred was deepened, full of conviction. "I should think so. Involving the ambassador of a foreign power." "Oh, the ambassador," protested the other, erect and slender, allowing himself a mere half-smile. "It would be stupid of me to advance anything of the kind. And it is absolutely unnecessary, because if I am right in my surmises, whether ambassador or hall porter, it's a mere detail." Sir Ethelred opened a wide mouth like a cavern into which the hooked nose seemed anxious to peer. There came from it a subdued, rolling sound as from a distant organ with the scornful indignation stop. "No, these people are too impossible. What do they mean by importing their methods of crime-tartary here? A Turk would have more decency." "You forget, Sir Ethelred, that strictly speaking we know nothing positively as yet." "No? But how would you define it, shortly?" "Barefaced audacity amounting to childishness of a peculiar sort." "We can't put up with the innocence of nasty little children," said the great and expanded personage, expanding a little more, as it were. The haughty, drooping glance struck crushingly the carpet at the Assistant Commissioner's feet. "They'll have to get a hard rap on the knuckles over this affair. We must be in a position to... What is your general idea, stated shortly? No need to go into details." "No, Sir Ethelred. In principle, I should lay it down that the existence of secret agents should not be tolerated as tending to augment the positive dangers of the evil against which they are used. That the spy will fabricate his information is a mere commonplace. But in the sphere of political and revolutionary action, relying partly on violence, the professional spy has every facility to fabricate the very facts themselves, and will spread the double evil of emulation in one direction, and of panic, hasty legislation, unreflecting hate on the other. However, this is an imperfect world." The deep-voiced presence on the hearth-rug, motionless with big elbows stuck out, said hastily, "Be lucid, please." "Yes, Sir Ethelred. An imperfect world. Therefore, directly the character of this affair suggested itself to me, I thought it should be dealt with special secrecy, and ventured to come over here." "That's right," approved the great personage, glancing down complacently over his double chin. "I am glad there's somebody over at your shop who thinks that the Secretary of State may be trusted now and then."